So data is very important, especially for our app. That's the reason why we went through the trouble of creating an account with the Weather or Open Weather API so that we can get that app ID, the API key we need in order for us to be able to retrieve data from the API. Okay, so I'm not going to go into too many details, but there's a lot of things that you can read about this API when you go to openweathermap.org, assuming that you went through the process, of course, of setting up and getting the API keys and so forth. But let's go to our APIs. Click APIs. And you can see that there are a lot of different places you can go to get information, right? So at the top here, we have the current weather data, hourly forecast, open one call, daily forecast 16 days, and so forth. Let's click on this daily forecast 16 days. Let's click there. And you can see it says here you can search 16-day weather forecast with daily average parameters by city name and so forth. And the most important thing here is that you can see where do we do the API call, the endpoint, right? So you can see it says openapi.org, data 2.5, forecast daily, and so forth, right? So this is the structure. Now, some of these parameters per se, we don't really need them, but this is good to see how to structure our API or our endpoint so that we can get something from the API. But the most important thing, also notice that they say you need to have that app ID, which we created earlier, and you should have that for things to work. But I already have something open. So if I open like this, you can see that I have this API open weather org data .5 forecast daily, and I have the queue for the query, it says Moscow, and then I have the app ID. You should add your own app ID there, API key, and then we have these units. There's imperial and there is metric. Imperial is Fahrenheit and miles per hour for wind. Metric is going to be, I think, meters per second for the wind, and Celsius for the weather, for the temperature. This is the API endpoint that we're going to be using. Very similar to what you see here, of course, with a few differences. So in this case here, if I add, in this case, I added Moscow and hit enter, you'll see then I have this payload here. Now, if you don't see the payload just like this, you can search on Chrome Store, JSON Viewer, that is the name of the plugin. There are many different plugins that allow you to see something like this, right? That's not important, but just in case you want to see the organized payload, JSON payload, as I see here. Okay, so you can just go to Chrome and look for Chrome extension. You can say JSON Viewer or something like that. You should get something that you can install on your browser and be able to see that, and be able to see something like this. All right, so it is important for us to know exactly what we're expecting to receive, because we will need this information in order for us to structure our data classes and so forth in our project. So that way we can use Retrofit, which is the HTTP library we're going to be using to retrieve data from these API. So as you can see here, the structure is very simple. We have, of course, as the outer object, it's an object because I have this curly brace there starting everything. And then I have this city, which is also an object, right? This is just a point and contains ID, name, coordinates, country, population, and so forth, right? And then we have here the list. If you close, you can see the list contains a few items. In fact, contains 7 items or 7 objects. These objects, this is what we are looking for, right? For each one of the items in our list, this is a day per se worth of the weather or the forecast. So this is day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like that. 7 days forecast, right? So this is where we're going to get all the information. So DT is daytime, is date per se, and this is time, Unix timestamp, which we'll need to deal with later. And this is also sunrise, the time when the sunrise is going to happen at that address in that city, in Moscow. Sunset, and then we have temperature for day, min, max, night, evening, and so forth. Okay. So as we change the names, let's say Portland Like that, you can see we get the information about Portland. And if I change the units here to metric, you will see that now we no longer have Fahrenheit, we have Celsius and so forth. Okay. So this is the structure that we are going to use. Rather, this is the API we're going to use to fetch all this data to show in our app. So by the end, of course, of these videos, or these lectures, I should say, we should see something like this. So all this information is coming from here. All right. So now that we have that, we have our endpoint, which we're going to hit to get that information. We need to understand then, how do we do that? Well, like I said, we're going to use Retrofit. Retrofit is an HTTP client, in this case, HTTP client that allows us to do these transactions, these calls to an API to get information. Now, the process of doing HTTP calls, it's really complicated. There's a lot of things that need to happen in order to work. Now, you can do all of that manually, but HTTP, in this case, Retrofit, I should say, Retrofit, it's a wonderful library that abstracts out all of the things that we need to or had to do before in order to be able to parse JSON data. So I really, really recommend you to use Retrofit. Now the setting up, especially with the dependency injection that we're going to be using, we're doing in our project, it may be a little bit strange at first, but I really recommend you to actually get used to it and keep that in mind and keep doing it so that you get used to it and you learn it, because it is the way to do it. Okay, whenever you want to fetch data from the internet. All right, now let's go back. Now that we have that piece of information, I think that's really important. Let's go back to our project. So back in our project here, the first thing we need to do is to find a way in which we can transform all of this into data classes. Data classes, in this case models, that we'll use in Kotlin to then convert what we see here, all this structure, into actual objects we can use to show information such as this. Right? So instead of trying to do all of that manually, what we can do, we can just copy this link. Remember this link that works, right? It goes and fetches data information about this city. And we're going to use that. Well, how do we use that? How do we create those models? Well, inside of earlier, we created this model package. What I'm going to do, I'm going to say right click like that, say new, and I'm going to go to Kotlin data class file from JSON. Now, the thing is, you may not have this because it's a plugin. So how do we install that Kotlin data class file from JSON? Well, all we do, we go to file, actually we go to Android in this case, we go to preferences, okay, and then we go to plugins, right? Inside of plugins, you can see we have two tabs. We have Marketplace and we have Installed. I want to go to Marketplace. In fact, if you keep on Installed, you can see that I do have JSON to Kotlin class. Like that, it's already installed. But in case you don't have, you come back to Marketplace and you search, say JSON, right, to Kotlin, if you don't see it, and there we go. JSON to Kotlin class. That's what you want. What you want to do, you will have this installed enable, which means you have to install, click install, follow the process. Okay, say okay at the bottom, you can see, and you should restart Android Studio and that will be installed in cases that you don't have that. In my case, I have that already, so I don't have to go through that. So right click again, new, say Kotlin data class file from JSON. And here we could paste the entire payload, but we're not going to do that because there's other ways to do so. Once you're here, right click, you say retrieve content from HTTP URL, which is what we want. That's why we copied the URL, just paste it all there. And I'm going to say okay. And voila. You can see it went and ran and put together, pretty much got the entire payload, all of this. Okay, as you see there, got it all into here. Now it's not very pretty because it's all in one line, but that doesn't matter because we don't care. All right, so now we're gonna add here the actual class. Right? We need to give it a class name. Right? So I'm just going to say weather like this, say generate, and after a few seconds you'll see that our model package is no longer empty. What happened? Open, and voila, you can see we have all these classes, right? So all of these classes, what are they doing? They're actually representing each one of these entry here that we have. We have CD, we have list, and inside of each list has other objects that are being represented when we created all these classes. Now we have a problem here because you notice that there's this class that doesn't have a name. So for us here, we can just call this weather. We'll see that this weather object is being called somewhere. That's why this weather class here, it's empty, or it has some problem because it's saying, well, this list is a list of an empty type. Well, it's not empty anymore. It's going to be a weather object like this. Okay. That also means I'm going to change the name of this KT there to something that we just looked at. Okay. Rename. I'm just going to call this, what do we call it? Weather object. You could name anything you want, but weather object sounds great. What that means, if you look at this structure here, city, count, cod, list, message. Let's go back to our payload. There's city, cod, message, count, list, right? So what are we saying that now is that this list is going to contain objects, type, weather object, which is all of this, cloud, degree, all that. We didn't have to do any of that. The plugin helped us out, which is really, really important. As you can see, we would have to take a long time to go and create a city object, coordinate, fields, and so forth. Now, some of these objects, or classes, I should say, data classes, we're not going to be using them. But nonetheless, it's okay to have everything set up just in case we want them as well.